We've witnessed a historic shift that has fundamentally altered the world order. The balance of global power is no longer what it was just a few years ago. For the first time since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, a U.S. president has spoken directly with Vladimir Putin. That phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin reshaped alliances and sent shockwaves through the international community. From the very beginning of the war, you're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. I'm not playing cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You think you're gambling with World War II. Relations between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have deteriorated since then. The question now is not whether U.S. support will wane, but how quickly and to what extent. A shift in American priorities has left Ukraine and its European allies in an uncertain position, one that could define the future security architecture of Europe. The harsh reality of sanctions and Russia's endurance. Over a decade of sanctions have failed to deter Russia. Its economy has proven far more resilient than most Western analysts predicted. The sweeping sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies were designed to cripple Russia's financial and industrial infrastructure. Yet the Russian war machine continues to churn, its economy adapting to the pressures imposed upon it. From the Kremlin's perspective, economic stability is secondary to military and geopolitical objectives. The question remains, how has Russia's economy survived the war? And more importantly, is there anything left in the toolbox to curtail its military ambitions? A war economy, Russia's economic backbone. Russia's economy now relies on two key pillars. Energy exports, oil and natural gas remain its primary sources of revenue. Despite sanctions, Russia continues to supply energy to major global consumers, including China and India. Military-industrial complex, the defense sector has become the most dynamic component of the Russian economy, with massive government spending fueling its expansion. The Kremlin has injected vast amounts of money to maintain economic stability, support defense production, and cushion industries impacted by Western sanctions. However, the militarization of the economy has led to labor shortages, with industries struggling to retain workers as the government prioritizes the war effort. This has resulted in economic overheating, driving inflation to levels unseen in years. While the Russian central bank has managed to keep inflation somewhat in check with high interest rates, now at a staggering 21%, this tight monetary policy hampers private sector growth. The Achilles heel, sanctions, oil, and the shadow fleet. Despite economic strains, Russia's fiscal space remains vast. Government spending has remained relatively balanced with revenue, keeping the deficit under 3%. However, this fiscal resilience is largely dependent on energy exports, particularly crude oil. Russia currently produces 10.4 million barrels per day, making it the world's third largest producer behind the US and Saudi Arabia. The West has attempted to limit Russian oil revenue through price caps and sanctions targeting Russia's shadow fleet, tankers that bypass Western restrictions. The Biden administration imposed stringent measures on Russian oil logistics just before leaving office, an effort seen by some as too little, too late. Meanwhile, the natural gas sector has suffered a severe blow. Once the dominant supplier to the EU, Russia has seen its market share plummet from 45% in 2021 to just 15% in 2023. While Norway and the US have stepped in to fill the gap, Russia has redirected its energy exports to Asia, particularly China and India. China, already a major importer of Russian energy, has become even more central to Russia's economic survival. The yuan is now widely used in Russia for international trade, displacing the dollar and euro in many transactions. India, once importing only 1% of its oil from Russia, now sources over 35 to 40% from Moscow. This growing dependence on Asia presents both opportunities and vulnerabilities. While China and India provide crucial lifelines, any shift in their stance could significantly impact Russia's economic stability. The military cost, casualties, public pressure, and the road ahead. The human cost of Russia's war is staggering. Western estimates put Russian casualties at over 800,000 killed and wounded since 2022. For any nation, such losses would be devastating. But in an authoritarian state like Russia, where political freedoms are virtually non-existent and dissent is harshly punished, public opposition remains muted. Historically, major powers have been forced to withdraw from prolonged conflicts due to mounting domestic pressure. Yet in Russia, the government's tight grip on society allows it to endure economic hardship and sustain military operations for longer than democratic nations typically can. The looming future, a fractured Europe and a rebuilding Ukraine. Europe stands at a crossroads. The United States has been the security guarantor of Europe for decades, but shifting political winds threaten to upend this role. The cost of rebuilding Ukraine could exceed $1 trillion, and Western resolve to finance such a colossal effort is uncertain. Meanwhile, Russia is playing the long game. The Kremlin knows that wars are not just won on the battlefield, but through economic endurance and strategic patience. While the West grapples with war fatigue, rising defense expenditures, and political division, Russia remains singularly focused on its objectives. A defining moment for the 21st century. No one wants to increase military spending, but the reality is that global security has fundamentally changed. The world now faces a crucial test. Will international law and norms prevail, or will might and military force dictate the new order? Russia is attempting to redraw international borders, a direct challenge to the post-World War II global order. Ukraine, a nation that voluntarily gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees, now finds those promises shattered. The implications stretch far beyond Eastern Europe. This is a defining moment not just for Ukraine or Russia, but for the world. The decisions made today will determine whether the future is governed by rules and laws, or by sheer power and force.